Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ken Gallagher. I'm a principal planner here at the Office of Planning and Development, and I've been really looking forward personally to seeing this presentation after hearing so much about it as it's been going on and learning some of the details. So we have two of the main creators of the Zoning Atlas with us this afternoon. So we have this afternoon Max Latona. He's the executive director of the Center for Ethics in Society at St. Anselm College. He's also a professor of philosophy at St. Anselm, and he's the former Brady Chair of Ethics Economics and the Common Good. He received his doctorate in philosophy from Boston College in 2001 and has published numerous articles in philosophy and ethics. He's a two-time winner of the Faculty Member of the Year Award and has been a member of the St. Anselm faculty since 2001. And our other speaker this afternoon is Jason Sorens. He's a senior research faculty in the American Institute for Economic Research. His research has focused on housing policy and land use regulation, fiscal federalism, U.S. state politics, and movements for regional autonomy and independence around the world. His most recent work studies the effects of zoning regulations on housing supply and cost, and the messaging that persuades voters to support more home building and zoning reform. He has taught at Yale, Dartmouth, St. Anselm, and the University of Buffalo. So with that, I will now let our first speaker take control of the PowerPoint, and on we go.
Thank you, Ken. I want to thank the Office of Planning and Development for inviting us to do this presentation, or permitting us to do it and facilitating it. Jason and I are very happy to be here, and happy to have so many of you in on this session. We're excited about the New Hampshire Zoning Atlas and eager to share with you what is this really exciting project that was produced by not only the Center for Ethics in Society and New Hampshire Housing, but also the Office of Planning and Development itself. So these three organizations have been working very hard for roughly around 16 months to produce this atlas, and it is now happily complete. And we'll go public, as you'll see in a moment, on May 9th, but is not as of yet public. So you're getting a pre-briefing, if you will, of this project. So I think I speak for Jason, myself, and the whole leadership team when I say that we're very eager to get your feedback and comments on this. Using the chat and function on the meeting here, we'd be happy to take questions, comments, and whatnot. And we'll be sure to reserve some time in the session for that. So Jason and I plan to go about 30 minutes, 35 minutes, 40 minutes at the outside, and there'll be plenty of time after for Q&A. So with that, I'm going to move forward and tell you a little bit about what the Atlas is. We'll talk about how it was developed, and we'll even show you how it works. And we also want to talk about some of the major findings that we have developed from a preliminary examination of the Atlas and its data. So first and foremost, our leadership team. So as I mentioned, we've been working on this about 16 months or so. In addition to Jason and myself, we want to give credit to Ben Frost, who many of you know is the Deputy Executive Director and Chief Legal Officer of New Hampshire Housing, and Noah Hodgetts, a Principal Planner to New Hampshire Office of Planning and Development. Rick Lederer Barnes, our GIS Specialist from Upstate GIS. Sarah Marchant, Chief of Staff and Vice President of Rock NH and the Community Loan Fund, but also someone very prominent in the planning community. And then, of course, Jason and myself. So what is the New Hampshire Zoning Atlas? Well, quite simply, it's a collaborative project to research, catalog, digitize, and graphically display all of New Hampshire's housing-related zoning regulations, community by community, district by district. So why do we need the New Hampshire Zoning Atlas? Well, I don't think I need to tell this audience that, we have a housing shortage in the state, and one of the primary limiters or regulators of housing production is, of course, our zoning ordinances, as found in our zoning code, our subdivision regulations, and even site plan review ordinances. And so in order to manage housing production, you need to understand zoning, but zoning is complicated. It's decentralized, as you know. We have many jurisdictions in the state. We'll even see exactly how many we have in a moment. And each of them has been granted authority by the state to zone as they see fit, and they do so very differently. So zoning is different from one jurisdiction to the next. And even within one jurisdiction, you have many districts, and of course, zoning varies from one district to the next. So it's not necessarily consistent from district to district. It's complex. We all know that. It's got many layers of regulations and ordinances that need to be understood and navigated. It's full of all sorts of different kinds of jargon, from verbiage that people ordinarily don't understand, easements and setbacks and accessory and all sorts of different terms. And then, of course, it's piecemeal. It's not necessarily systematically put together, as you know, but each community can adapt and change their ordinances from one year to the next. And so in the end, you sometimes have a somewhat unsystematic zoning code and perhaps zoning map. So what we hope to do with this zoning atlas is really just to produce greater understanding, to give people in communities, community leaders, planners, policymakers, and really statewide, the tools that they need to have an informed discourse about the ways zoning in our communities, both individually in each community, but collectively across our communities, is affecting housing supply and affordability. So next slide. So I do also want to acknowledge our partners. So in addition to the organizations who have developed this, we also had some funding from New Hampshire Realtors, from the Mercatus Center at George Mason, Evernorth, and Charles Koch Foundation. We want to thank them for their support. Without it, we couldn't have produced this atlas. I also want to acknowledge that we have some national partners. So this is a movement across the United States. There are over 20 other states that are producing an atlas. In fact, there are some that are not even on this map yet. Washington State and Georgia are producing an atlas. We, however, in New Hampshire, as of May 9th, will be the third state to produce a complete atlas after Connecticut and Montana. So we're even ahead of our New England partners who are working hard at their own atlases. Just quickly, the timeline and the milestones for this project. We started over a year ago in putting the leadership team together in January 2022, secured funding by March 2022, hired all of our zoning and geospatial analysts in April and May of 2022. And those were primarily young, bright students who live in New Hampshire, but attend universities from around the Northeast, from many different disciplines and walks of life. We interviewed them carefully, found students who could do meticulous, detailed work, and we hired them, and they worked together all of last summer in the library on campus with Jason's supervision, reading 23,000 pages of zoning codes and looking at all the zoning maps. And some even had to go drive up to the borders of New Hampshire to communities to take photos of paper maps to bring them back down. So we did a tremendous amount of work, and I want to thank all of those students for the great work they did in coding and producing this atlas. And then last fall, our geospatial team did their work on the GIS files. And then in this early part of this year, we worked on producing the interactive map, the story map, as you'll see in a moment, and planning the rollout. So the rollout plan, as I mentioned, we're doing some pre-briefings with important stakeholders, this group being one of them. And then we're also going to be presenting to the legislature, reaching out to media, and there'll be a public launch event on May 9th. You're all invited to attend that in person or online. We're very excited. We'll have some important speakers speaking there, panel discussion with some distinguished persons, presentation of the atlas, and more. And then after that, we hope to stimulate more atlas conversations around the state to do updates with the atlas and the data. We do plan to do that. And then also perhaps to do some more focused analyses of data and zoning data with regard to individual communities to help, again, provide them with more information about how their communities perhaps are zoning in comparison to the rest of the state. So those are some things that we plan to do. And now I will turn it over to my colleague, Jason, who who is going to now talk a little bit about the data, the methodology, and the findings. Jason?
Thank you, Max. All right, and I'm going to try to move through this rather quickly. Let me see here. All right, zoning atlas scope. We looked at zoning, subdivision, and site plan review ordinances and zoning maps. Everything is coded as of June 1, 2022. We wanted to have a consistent stop date so that we could compare the situation across all municipalities in a consistent way. As Max mentioned, we had to digitize some zoning maps and in some cases correct GIS layers that we received from various sources. The unit of analysis in our data sets is the zoning district. So that's the row you could think of in the spreadsheets. 269 jurisdictions that we have in our data set. That includes 215 cities and towns with zoning, 10 submunicipal and village districts that have independent zoning authority, 23 unincorporated places zoned by Coos County, 19 towns without zoning, and 2 unincorporated places without zoning. If you really want to get into the data, there are 2 data sets. The first is a publicly available Google Sheet. This is where the researchers entered the data on the regulations in each zoning district, and that includes text descriptions of complex regulatory features, and it has every zoning district in the state, including those that are not mapped, which I'll explain momentarily. Then there's also a fully quantitative table in comma separated values format that merges base and overlay segments so that we can then code for each base overlay segment the regulatory features that apply to that particular piece of land. And in this case, we don't have, of course, the overlays that are not mapped. Otherwise, we couldn't calculate those base overlay segments. We also interpret all complex text descriptions of regulations in a quantitative fashion so that researchers could use it to create statistical analysis. And we also interpret state law, for instance, for ADU ordinances. When a town doesn't have an ADU ordinance, we interpret the features that apply under state law. Unmapped districts are those that are not included officially on zoning maps. They could be defined by often hydrological features, the presence of wetland vegetation, things like that. So these are all overlay districts. So we have them in that first data set, but we don't obviously include them in the map because they're unmapped. There are some extinct districts. These are districts that appear in official zoning maps that are legally binding but don't appear in the zoning ordinances. And so what we've done is we've gone back to the last version of the ordinance in which the district did appear to find out what the regulatory features of those districts are. Some towns have unregulated areas that are not zoned or not treated as a district. They may have some regulatory features that apply town-wide to them. These are, without exception, public lands. So these are areas that are not available for development right now. But in principle, they could be made available for development, and we want to make sure that we code all the regulations for the entire land area of the state. So we have to include these as unregulated areas. There are 2 general types of zoning district, residential and non-residential. Residential where some type of housing development is allowed, non-residential where housing development is not allowed. Those residential zoning districts are in turn broken down into 2 types, primarily residential, where no general category of commercial use is allowed other than typical sort of uses found in residential neighborhoods like churches and schools and utilities and government buildings, things like that. So if you allow retail or you allow professional offices or research laboratories or something like that, hospitals, medical facilities, any general category of commercial or industrial use, you then get classified as mixed with residential. And then non-residential districts are broken down into three types: primarily commercial, primarily industrial, and primarily conservation or agricultural. And this, by the way, is an area where we go beyond the National Zoning Atlas methodology to provide a little more detail for users of the New Hampshire Atlas. We consider use zoning for every district. So we code whether 1 family, 2 family, 3 family, 4 family, and 5+ family structures are allowed either by right or subject to a public hearing. And that could be either a special permit, conditional use permit, or special exception, or they're subject to site plan review, which also introduces some discretion and a public hearing. We code variables relating to affordable housing, whether there are incentives for affordable housing, how affordability is defined, and so on. We have several variables relating to accessory dwelling units, and we also code how manufactured housing is treated, another addition in our atlas that other state atlases don't have yet. For each of those types of housing, we then also code the dimensional and parking regulations. So that includes minimum lot size, setbacks, minimum frontage, maximum height, maximum lot coverage, minimum unit size, maximum bedrooms, and things like that. We also code whether a certain type of structure, say 3 family, is allowed only for elderly or only for affordable housing. All right, I'm going to introduce just in general what the map is going to look like, and at the end of our presentation, Max will give you a demonstration of how this works. So story map is ArcGIS speak for a text analysis of the major features and findings of our project. And so you'll find a description of what we're up to here, as well as illustrative photos and maps and findings that go beyond our what we can present in this presentation. We've also done a Manchester area analysis that brings together the zoning atlas data with data on utilities, so water and sewer, and data on where buildings are located. And that allows us to do something more like a build-out analysis, where we can then say, okay, we know which areas have been developed to the potential of the zoning. How many units would be available that are on parcels that have not been developed yet? The interactive atlas is another feature that we have, where you can go into a map and you can click around and you can find pop-up. You get pop-ups here that will give you the zoning features of zoning districts, also give you zone jurisdiction information, links to the regulatory codes, and so on. So I'm going to run through 6 findings that we thought were significant ones. These are just a few of the uses to which you could put this atlas. So our first finding looks at what we call small lot single family. So we're looking at what percentage of the state's buildable land area, that is outside interstate highways, water bodies, and permanently conserved areas. Those are in gray on this map. Setting those aside, what percentage of the land area is available for single family development on less than an acre with less than 200 feet of minimum frontage? And we find that 16% of the state's buildable area allows for single family homes on small lots. All right, and so we took this threshold of 1 acre because according to state DES guidelines, there are some soils and slopes where you could have well and septic on less than an acre, and we found this was a common break point in a lot of zoning districts. 40,000 square feet is a pretty common minimum lot size. That's 0.92 acre. So these are definitely small lots. We also have some findings on what we call medium lot as single family, so less than 2 acres with less than 300 feet of frontage, and that's that is definitely doable under state DES guidelines on the vast majority of soil and slope combinations. And there we find it's about 1/3 of the state's land area that's available for medium lot single family. Finding number 2, we look at small lot 2 family. Here, that is defined as, again, minimum lot size less than an acre, less than 200 feet of minimum frontage, and more than a maximum density, if there is a maximum density specified in the code, of more than 2 units per acre. All right, so this is relatively dense form of development for duplexes, and we find that only 11% of the state's buildable area allows for duplexes under these conditions, and you'll see a lot of it is actually in rural areas and not in the more densely populated southeastern third of the state. We also find that there are 70 jurisdictions that don't allow any kind of two-family by right anywhere. Then we look at 5+ family, and we actually find that there's more land available for small lot 5+ family. So looking at the same density that we had with 2 family, there's actually a higher percentage of the land area available for that. So that's less than 2.5 acre minimum lot size, less than 300 feet of minimum frontage, and again, greater than 2 units per acre. That's 21% of the state's buildable area available for 5+ family homes on smaller lots. And then in yellow, you see down there, I believe that's Londonderry. There's an additional 1% of the land area that's available for this kind of development only for affordable or elderly housing. Our next finding drills down on Manchester and the surrounding towns. So this is the quasi build-out analysis that I mentioned earlier. And so in this area, we found that in terms of just the zoning, 21% of the buildable land area was available for small lot single family. But then once we excluded lots that were already developed, that percentage falls to 7.8%. And you can see that these areas are rather scattered, and in a couple jurisdictions, there's no land available for that kind of development. Finding number 5, this relates to ADUs. So under state law, of course, ADUs must be allowed in single family districts, but municipalities have a wide range of options to regulate them. So in orange here, you see places where ADUs are allowed by right, so you don't need a conditional use permit or special exception, and less than 2 spaces. So either 0 or 1 parking space is required for an ADU. So this is where ADUs can be developed without too much trouble. That's about 42% of the buildable area. Then in yellow, you see places where either 2 parking spaces are required for an accessory dwelling unit, and maybe it's by right, or it's a public hearing with 0, 1, or 2 spaces. So it could be a conditional use permit or special exception. And so you see a large part of the land area is available only under those conditions, which are somewhat more restrictive and potentially more costly. For instance, to put in 2 parking spaces as a homeowner. And then in pink, you see a few places where ADUs are required to have 3 or even 4 parking spaces. And there's one jurisdiction that I won't mention right now where a single family home has to have 3 spaces and an ADU has to have 4 spaces. So you need 7 parking spaces to have a single family home with an ADU. And then there are a few non-residential areas where ADUs are prohibited. Finding number 6 looks at manufactured housing. In orange, you see places where manufactured housing is broadly available. It's available on single-family small lots, and it's available in manufactured housing parks as well. So that is 9.9% of the developable land where manufactured housing is broadly available. And then you see in yellow a few places where it's not allowed in parks, but it is allowed on small individual lots. In brown, you see places where it's allowed in parks, but either not on individual lots or not on small individual lots, right? The minimum lot size might be an acre or more. And then in sort of maroon, you see the places where manufactured housing is not available under either of those conditions. So not necessarily prohibited entirely, but it's not available either in parks or on small individual lots. All right, and with that, I am going to hand it back to Max.
I'd like to just jump in for a moment. We do have one comment, or I think is actually a question. I'm wondering if this might be the right time to ask it. The comment is from Susan Peters. Hopeful that the atlas will show which communities have public water and sewer, a key underpinning to zoning. So can you maybe speak to that?
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have those data. Those data are not available statewide. They're partial data is available from multiple sources, but no one yet has been able to make this consistent and up to date, right? So we have some layers that are a couple decades old now, but yeah, so that is a key factor here. And so what we have in the data set is we do show where things like minimum lot size and minimum frontage and maximum density vary according to access to utilities and soil type.
Great, thank you.
Great, thanks, Jason. So yeah, we'll just wrap up here with a discussion of some of the implications and impact of the atlas, and then we'll do a little bit of a demonstration of the atlas itself. So to begin with, I guess the number one takeaway is that zoning matters. Again, as I mentioned, we talk about a housing crisis, but maybe we're not talking enough about the ways in which zoning is limiting housing production, and the ways in which communities themselves can make some reasonable adjustments to their zoning to encourage modest housing production. So our zoning atlas and our team does not take a position on what changes need to be made or even how they're to be made, whether to be made at the community level or, as some people have discussed, through some sort of state mandates. But what we do want to provide is important information that will help inform that conversation at the community level, at the state level, and give people what they need to know in order to make a decision on this. So questions such as, what does zoning do? What does individual layers or regulations of zoning, how does that impact housing production? And and generally, what is the relationship between zoning and housing production in our communities individually, but also collectively in aggregate? Zoning matters too, because there are really two purposes of zoning that we've seen, and I don't need to tell all of you this, but originally zoning was about use, keeping the right things from the wrong places, which was perhaps justified, 100 years ago or so. And then, of course, in the 1970s and 80s, when the building booms were happening, communities got concerned about growth and rapid growth. And so a lot of zoning was enacted in order to limit or even outright prohibit some forms of housing production. And what we see as a pattern, of course, is that communities are more permissive of large lot single family development and often discouraging other forms of housing production. So zoning has mattered and makes a difference. A second impact or implication of the atlas is that we realize that state law matters. It matters in at least three ways. First, insofar as communities and jurisdictions do have the power to zone. Again, New Hampshire is not a home rule state, as we know, but jurisdictions or communities are given the authority to zone by the state. And the state can, of course, withdraw or restrict that authority however it might like. So just the fact that communities have this power is, of course, an indication of the power of state law. But then, of course, as well, we've seen things such as the accessory dwelling unit legislation in 2017, which requires communities to allow internal and attached accessory dwelling units wherever single family homes are permitted. That has had an impact. As we've seen from the one of the findings in the graphic, we see that ADUs are permitted widely throughout the state. However, we've also seen that because the state really gives communities a lot of flexibility in how they regulate ADUs, many municipalities use that flexibility to make ADU development somewhat difficult. An example of that is to require 3 or 4 parking spaces for a single ADU, which could, for all intents and purposes, be a studio with only one person in it. So we've seen that state law matters insofar as it's required communities to permit it, but state law has also mattered insofar as it allows a certain amount of flexibility that communities sometimes use to discourage that kind of development. And another example of that is, of course, the workforce housing law. The workforce housing law, RSA 674, requires communities to provide reasonable and realistic opportunities for the development of workforce housing, defined as 5+ units. So an example of how that's had an impact is, I think Jason showed, it's easier to build a 5+ unit throughout New Hampshire. It's at some 21% of buildable area permits that, in comparison to duplexes, which was only 11%. So you might ask, well, why are 5+ family more permitted than duplexes? And one answer might be the workforce housing law on the part of the state. So it has mattered. On the other hand, because there's a lot of latitude and flexibilities that communities have in terms of how they regulate that workforce housing, we see that a lot of communities are doing the very bare minimum, regardless of whether it's really reasonable or not, to allow such units to be built. And that could be something as simple as a minimum lot size requirements. So state law does matter. And finally, I'll say that, there is room for change. I think the Atlas has shown us at the leadership team, and also some of the communities that we've given pre-briefings to, that there is some room for adjustments. As you know from the recent housing needs assessment from New Hampshire Housing, we're some 3,500 units short currently in terms of what housing we need to support our population and workforce. And then estimates are that by 2030, given growth, we'll need an additional 60,000 units, and by 2040, some 90,000 units. So we're looking at some serious shortage of housing. And what does that mean? It doesn't necessarily mean we need to flood individual communities with massive amounts of housing. But what it does probably mean is that we need modest increases of housing in communities throughout New Hampshire to support our aging seniors, young families, young professionals who want to establish roots there, our workforce, for our businesses. Speaking of businesses, local zoning barriers do impede economic growth statewide. We all know this. We hear from employers around the state that they're having a terrible time attracting employees to the state because of the shortage of housing. And, the worry is, of course, that without affordable places to live, new employees will look elsewhere, and perhaps even more concerning, employers will look elsewhere in order to set up shop. So we need to be mindful of that. And so finally, I'll just say that I think one of the main takeaways from the Atlas is hopefully that we can, in our communities, adjust our zoning to be more welcoming to housing. And the ways in which we do that are probably manifold, and for individual communities to decide, perhaps using the Atlas as a tool to help them have that conversation. So with that, I'm going to try to do a little bit of a demonstration here. So let me try clicking these links and let's see what happens. So I'm going to begin with the story map. As I mentioned, on May 9th, this is all going to go public. There'll be a landing page on the college website for the New Hampshire Zoning Atlas, welcoming everybody, providing them with our findings, with all of the tools, with all of the data that they can download, some information about how the Atlas was developed, some interviews with our wonderful students who put this together, but also the story map and the interactive Atlas. So the story map, so Ken, I'm going to ask if.
Yep, I'm going to need to stop the presentation, the PowerPoint, and then you can share your screen.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Sounds good. And it'll just take me a moment to do that, everybody.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's see.
Let's see. There we go. Okay.
Okay, so now to share my screen, I have to figure out how to do that.
There's a button on the upper right, I think, if you have the same layout that I do.
Yeah. One moment, people. Open share tray. I think I've found the place to do that. So let's see. let's try this. Okay. Ken, can you see that?
I see New Hampshire zoning atlas. Yes.
Oh,
Looks
excellent.
good.
Okay, so this, excellent. Thank you everybody for your patience. So this is the story map. So if people would like a little bit of an introduction to the atlas, to learn about it, how it was developed, and so on, they could go through this story map, which gives them a little bit of the background of the atlas, the data and the methodology. Then it goes through many of the statewide findings that we just discussed with all of you. So they'll get a little bit of an explanation with a graphic, and there'll be some additional findings here that we did not discuss with you, including the Manchester area analysis. So after we get through manufactured housing, we have some additional findings, and then they'll be prompted if they like to go through some of these additional findings by scrolling to the right or the left. And as I mentioned, we have this further analysis with Manchester that will help them to see that sort of quasi build-out analysis that Jason discussed. So a lot of the findings that we looked at here, and even some additional ones, will be available with explanation and graphic map in the story map. So we wanted to make the atlas very digestible, not just give them an interactive atlas that has a lot of clicking, but to show them how to use it and maybe some of the takeaways. The story map will also give them access to the interactive atlas, which I'll show you in a moment, and provide them with some conclusions and next steps. Okay, so that is the story map. And now what I'd like to do is show you the atlas itself. So this is the big unveiling, if you will. So Ken, can you see, welcome to the New Hampshire Zoning Atlas? Yes, Jason.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So when the user comes to the atlas, the interactive atlas itself, they'll have a little pop-up screen that gives them a welcome, gives them some instructions on how to use the tool, some basics about the data, and even has some links to learn more about it to go to that story map or to download the data itself through another link. So they can click off that, and then they will see the atlas itself. And you get the full statewide view here. And at any point, you can, of course, click in and drill down. It needs a moment or two to adjust. And it'll take you to an individual jurisdiction, anywhere you want to go. And if you click on an individual community, you'll get a pop-up. And the pop-up will first give you jurisdiction information. So here we're in randomly the town of Bridgewater in Grafton County. And it tells you about the jurisdiction that it's 94% residential, 2% mixed use, 0% commercial industrial. And then if you scroll down a little bit, you get some more details about the type of the treatment of housing and what's permitted. 1 family and 2 family are permitted in 96%, but 3, 4, and 5 are not permitted by right here. And then you have some links. You can go directly to the zoning code, the subdivision regulations, and the site plan regulations. Then, if you use the arrow at the bottom, you can click over and then you can get district information. So beyond the general jurisdiction information, now we can look at this district. And we see that it's the Bridgewater Rural Residential District. And we see that 1 and 2 family treatment are allowed or / conditional, but that 3, 4, and 5 plus are prohibited. And then you get all of the zoning details, the dimensional regulations that Jason went through. So for example, minimum lot size. So here, for example, you need 5 acres in order to build a single family home. And you'll get the setback requirements for single family, setback requirements for 2 family. And then of course, there's no setback requirements for 3, 4, and 5 family because they're prohibited. And then let's see what else is down here. Yeah, there's some ADU and other information down at the bottom. So that's one way of using the atlas, is just to click on an individual area or an individual. You can even put a particular property location in up in the search bar and get the information on the zoning of that district that pertains to that property. Anyhow, I'm going to zoom back out, because there's another way to use this cool atlas. That is, on the left here, you have all these sort of interactive clickable things you can do. So for example, we could click on the 5+ family allowed layer, and then suddenly the map will color those areas which permit 5+ family by right, and then in the orange area, and then in the yellow area, it's in the mixed with residential areas, and then let's see, you have the non-residential areas as well, but that, of course, that's not permitted there. So then you could also click on where detached ADUs are permitted. It takes a moment for the atlas to adjust, and you can see, and again, you can click in to get more detail on the individual jurisdictions and districts. And then you could do age-restricted multifamily, multifamily with affordable housing restrictions, and then also manufactured housing. We can look at where it's allowed in parks only. We need to turn the toggle on. We can look at where it's allowed on individual lots only, and so on and so forth. Now, here's what's really cool is you can also look at minimum lot size requirements. So for example, we could say, where in the state is a single family home allowed between under an acre in minimum lot size? And so, as Jason had shown you earlier, I think that's roughly 16% of the state allows minimum single families in the minimum lot of an acre or less. But we could also look to see if, well, communities require larger lots. So let's say between 10 and 100 acres for the sake of argument. And sure enough, there are some communities that require you to have 10 acres in order to build a minimum, a single family home. I can't imagine any communities require 20 acres, but let's just see for the sake of argument. And lo and behold, there are a few that require a minimum of 20 acres. I'm not going to call them out here in order to build a single family home. So at any rate, you can use the atlas to look at all of these features, either individually of individual properties or districts and jurisdictions, or statewide with these many different layers. So I'm going to stop sharing there. And Jason, did I miss anything in my demonstration? I know it was a little clumsy.
No, I think that was great. Yeah, thank you, Max.
Okay, so now we will take any comments or questions that you may have. And we thank you all for your attention and patience. Can't imagine that clear.
To get it started, I guess I have a question. What sort of plans are there for keeping this updated?
Yeah, great question. So we are planning to continue to update and maintain a consistent time series that will allow researchers then to look at changes in zoning and what are the consequences of that. We haven't yet decided, it's sort of funding dependent, whether that will be every year or every other year. And I'll also note that we are open to any corrections that you find need to be made. We are confident in the accuracy of the data overall, but bear in mind that we have 192 fields and 2,139 zoning districts. So it's about 400,000 individual pieces of data. And we're not expecting that every single one of them will be perfectly accurate. So I'm sure there could be some corrections. And if you come across any, please let us know at ethics@anselm.edu. That's our email address.
Great, and I want to mention that we also have another email address, Jason, which it's just been created by the college. It's nhzongingatlas@anselm.edu, so that people can email us there too.
I'm putting that in the chat right now. So
actually, yeah, I might have misspoke. It's zoningatlas@anselm.edu. It's zoningatlas@anselm.edu. So
Zoning
any kind of
atlas.
changes, questions, suggestions, they can email us there.
Okay.
Thanks, Ken. So we do hope that that this tool will be useful. So if anybody would like to beta test it, and by that I mean get this tool and have the password and access and login to play around with it, and let us know what they think, we'll be happy to share that with you. Just send us an email and say, hey, I'd like to beta test the Atlas, again, to zoningatlas@anselm.edu. And we'll send along the link and the password and login information. Especially this community here, people who are familiar with zoning, who care about their communities, who care about perhaps housing in their communities. We'd love to get your feedback on that.
Okay. Go ahead. We do have plenty of time for further questions, but go ahead, Max. Sorry.
Oh no, I was just going to say, I mean, if people don't have any comments or questions, we're happy to let them have a longer break if they like.
Sure.
Session. So
yeah.
Okay. I do want to say though, I will say, not just as a time filler, but normally when Jason and I have done these pre-briefings, we have our whole team. We have Noah, who's with the Office of Planning and Development. I'm sure he's engaged otherwise today. Ben Frost and Sarah Marchand and our GIS specialist, and they can provide other insight to the Atlas that maybe Jason and I are not conveying at the moment. But there's a whole other team behind this, is what I'm saying.
Absolutely. So anyway, like they've said, you can reach them at zoningatlas@anselm.edu. Likewise, I'm going to put up just a link for move forward here, just to keep our conferences meeting your needs. We do have this link here to the evaluation form. Just give us any feedback if you want. And I see somebody else is typing right now, so we'll just hold on.
Thank you for the nice comments, Susan. And
yeah.
Kate.
Okay. All right. Well, if that's it, then we will finish a little early, and we will resume just to make sure with people who are planning to come to the last one get there. We will continue to resume at 2:15. So thank you once again to Max and to Jason for this very informative presentation, and look forward to using it myself. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ken. Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Ken.